Had I been in a hunting area, I would have shot him at this point. Being in the national park, I kept shouting and hoped he would change his mind. At about 4 paces, he shook his head. No, he wasn't interested in stopping. But by the time his head steadied to permit an accurate shot, he was way too close. His head was perhaps 20 yards from me, and the tips of his tusks were considerably closer. I stepped back as I fired a Norma solid. I lost my footing on the broken ground and went down just as the elephant collapsed in mid-stride. It was a perfect brain shot, and he went down instantly. But 3.5 to 4 tons of elephant moving at close to 25 miles an hour has some momentum. So he slid forward, arriving at the same spot on the ground as I did at about the same time. I have no idea what hit me, the tusk or the trunk, but something did and broke my left forearm. At first I didn't notice. I hit the ground, the elephant hit me. I rolled and came up with the rifle reloaded and ready for action. It wasn't necessary. The elephant was dead, and then I noticed just how sore my arm was. Don Heath, Unexpected Product Test, 4 May 2012.
Hi there, John McAdams here. Thanks for joining me in this episode where I compare and contrast the legendary British 375 H&H Magnum with the German 9.3x62mm. Now, I have rifles chambered in both cartridges. I have hunted extensively with both, and I really like both rounds. So I'm going to discuss the pros, cons, and recommended use cases for both the 9.3x62 and the 375 H&H with you in detail in this episode. I will also share a few stories and video clips involving both cartridges, and I'll also share some information on how they have both performed in ballistic gel with you here today. And yes, I will also reveal what cartridge Don Heath was using in that story I just referenced at the beginning of this episode. Before we get started, I need to be upfront with you about something. I have a strong personal affinity for the 9.3x62. I do prefer it over the 375. That said, I also really like the 375. I appreciate all the advantages it offers hunters. So we're going to talk about all of that stuff in this episode. So let's dive right into things with the 9.3x62 and the 375.
The 375 H&H Magnum is a larger caliber, flatter shooting, and more powerful cartridge. It's also loaded to a higher pressure as well. The 375 is loaded to a SAAMI max average pressure of 62,000 psi, the 9.3 57,500 psi. The 375 also has a physically larger case and can hold more powder. I measured the powder capacity of some fired Hornady brass for both cartridges, came up with an average of 76.1 grains of water for the 9.3 and 96.7 grains of water for the 375. That is about 27% more case capacity for the 375. So add it all up, the 375 is a physically much larger cartridge, can hold more powder, fires a larger caliber bullet, and is loaded to a higher pressure. So yes, it is more powerful than the 9.3. But on the flip side, the 9.3x62 has quite a bit less recoil. This cartridge also penetrates surprisingly well, too. More on this in a second. Now, because the 375 H&H is a physically larger cartridge, it also requires physically larger and more expensive rifles. Overall length of the 375 H&H cartridge is 3.6 inches long. That requires a longer Magnum length action, while the shorter 9.3x62 will fit in a 30-06 length action. The 9.3 has a SAAMI spec overall length of 3.291 inches, so it's actually a little bit shorter than a 30-06. Germany had all of these colonies in Africa prior to World War I. Well, German Southwest Africa turned into what is now Namibia and was administered by South Africa for a long time. Tanganyika was taken over by the British, and the German colonies of Cameroon and Togoland were split between the British and the French. So, long story short, the British took over almost all of the German African colonies after World War I. And yes, even South Africa at the time was a self-governing dominion within the British Empire. Well, for that reason, combined with just the chaos going on in Germany after the war, supplies of 9.3 by 62 rifles and ammo really dried up, and the British stepped in and started to fill that void with their rifles and ammunition, especially the 375 H&H. Later on, a lot of those colonies adopted that 375 caliber minimum for hunting thick-skinned dangerous game, which the 9.3 by 62, which fires .366 caliber bullets, falls a little short of. And there are exceptions to this, and I'll talk about that shortly too. The 375 also became extremely popular in North America, the United States in particular, especially after World War II. The end result is the 375 H&H is much more widely used today. Though some would argue whether it's a big bore or a medium bore, if we defined a big bore cartridge as something that is both legal and widely accepted for use on thick-skinned dangerous game, the 375 H&H is far and away the most popular big bore cartridge in the world. And it is an excellent rifle cartridge. Here's what Finn Agard had to say about the cartridge in the book Any Shot You Want. The virtue of the 375 H&H is that it works well on even the largest beast without generating horrendous recoil. Most hunters can learn to tolerate it sufficiently to place their shots where they need to go. If he asked, I always advised a client to bring a scope-sighted 375 for dangerous game rather than an iron-sighted heavy. He would shoot better with it, and placement of the first shot, assuming adequate penetration and no bullet failure, is the key issue. If the client put the bullet in the right spot, there would be far less chance that I would have to take up my .458 to follow some sick and nasty animal into the thick stuff. That is still true. The 375 H&H remains, now more than ever, what Hollands meant it to be, the ultimate all-around big game cartridge. End of quote. That is a true statement. I agree wholeheartedly with what Finn had to say there. That said, there are a lot of the same advantages to both the 375 H&H and the 9.3, and there is a tremendous overlap in the best use cases for each one. And you could essentially say the same thing about the 9.3 that Finn said in that excerpt I just read to you, but it's just a little bit less powerful and has a little less recoil. So how much of a difference are we talking about here? Well, the 375 shoots .375 caliber bullets. The 9.3 shoots .366 caliber bullets. That is a difference of 9 1/1000ths of an inch. A typical load for the 9.3 shoots a 286 grain bullet at about 2,360 feet per second, which works out to just over 3,500 foot-pounds of energy. A momentum value of 96, a Taylor KO value of 35. The 375 H&H, typical load for it, 300 grain bullet at 2,550 feet per second. That generates about 4,300 foot-pounds of kinetic energy, 109 momentum, 40 KO value. So the 375 has about 22% more kinetic energy, about 13% more momentum, and about a 14% higher Taylor KO value than the 9.3. It is certainly more powerful. Is it more effective? Is it better? Yes and no. As a quick aside, I'm not saying the Taylor KO factor is the end-all, be-all, or anything like that here. I think it's just an interesting way to compare cartridges that also incorporates frontal diameter. We are in the midst of a trend overall towards smaller calibers, but there is certainly something to the effectiveness of a bigger bore round, especially on really big game. And furthermore, some places still have that 375 caliber minimum for hunting dangerous game. But like I mentioned earlier, there are exceptions. Zimbabwe is a great example of this. They have a 9.2 millimeter minimum. That's a remnant of Don Heath's affinity for the cartridge. So sometimes that 9,000ths larger diameter makes a big difference between being on the right side versus the wrong side of the law. So I have conversations with professional hunters all the time, and especially if we're talking about hunting buffalo or something, it'll often come up, hey, what cartridge do you recommend that I bring if I go on this hunt? And they'll usually say something like, I'd really like you to bring a 375 H&H at a minimum, and if you can shoot it well, yeah, bring something bigger. And then I'll ask, well, what about a 9.3 by 62? And they'll almost always say, oh yeah, that's fine too. So despite what the numbers might appear to say at first glance, the 9.3 by 62 certainly seems to quote-unquote punch above its weight. That has been my experience using it afield. That has also been my experience shooting into ballistic gel. In general, when we're using the same bullets for each one, I have observed the 375 H&H will make a larger wound than the 9.3 by 62, but the 9.3 will generally penetrate better. That is the case with every single load I have tested for both cartridges when using expanding bullets. Now, I do have to give my normal disclaimer before I start talking about this in more detail. Results in ballistic gel, especially clear gel like I use, don't normally translate exactly one-to-one into real-world situations on game. Bullets tend to penetrate better, but not make as large of a wound cavity in clear gel versus on a real-life animal. Animals also aren't completely homogeneous like gel is either. So the results that I'm about to tell you about should be taken as a general trend. I'm not saying that if a bullet penetrates X number of inches in gel, that it will penetrate exactly that far in real animals from every angle, regardless of what it hits all the time. I'm just saying that if a bullet demonstrates wide, shallow penetration in gel, it'll also probably produce wide, shallow penetration on animals. Likewise, if bullet A penetrates better than bullet B in gel, it will probably penetrate better than bullet B in an animal as well. Same thing with the wound cavity it makes, etc. So take all that for what you will. I tested loads for each one with a Swift A-frame. For the 9.3, I used a 286 grain Swift A-frame in a hand load that I actually made a long time ago for use on a buffalo hunt. I actually killed a buffalo with this exact load out of this exact rifle. And then I used a Federal factory load for the 375 H&H with a 300 grain Swift A-frame. Both cartridges produced wide wound cavities. The 375 was a little bit larger than the 9.3. Penetration was excellent for the 375, but the 9.3 penetrated even deeper. But both of those A-frame loads would be outstanding for use on buffalo. And like I said, I've done it myself. I know a lot of other people do too. So with soft point bullets like these, the 375 does have the edge in terms of the size of wound the bullet produces. However, the 9.3 has the edge in terms of penetration. With solids, the 375 H&H has the edge in both areas. Okay, so why is this the case? Well, the fact that the 375 makes a wider wound really shouldn't be surprising. It's a larger caliber bullet. It's also going faster. But you would expect that a projectile with more momentum like the 375 would also penetrate better when you're talking about using the same bullets for each cartridge. However, as far as I can tell, the reason this occurs is the higher impact velocity of the 375 results in relatively more expansion for that bullet. That in turn subjects the bullet to more drag as it travels through the gel or through the animal, and it just doesn't penetrate quite as deep. Indeed, the 286 and 300 grain A-frame loads had the same sectional density before I fired them, but afterwards, when I recovered them, the 375 H&H actually had a slightly lower sectional density than the recovered 9.3 millimeter projectile. And of course, that is not the case when discussing and comparing non-expanding solid projectiles for each cartridge. Now, while this is all very interesting, let's not lose the forest through the trees here. The 9.3 did produce a perfectly adequate wound channel, and the 375 had more than enough penetration for both circumstances. So just like how the number 100 is only a little bit bigger than the number 99, I wouldn't say it is a significant difference either way. But it is true that in general, each cartridge has the edge in those areas I just described nonetheless. Now, with all of this talk about the fantastic penetration of the 9.3 by 62, it is a reasonable question to ask, gosh, do I need to worry about over-penetration with this cartridge? Is it a concern where I could hit an animal and then hit an unseen animal behind it? That's an excellent question. Now, I've often quoted a blurb from Kevin Robertson's book, Africa's Most Dangerous, where he relates a conversation that he had when he purchased his 9.3x62 from an old timer that used that rifle for crop protection work against buffalo. That gentleman he bought it from talked about using that cartridge specifically because bullets from it were unlikely to exit a buffalo and hit an unseen buffalo behind them. Furthermore, he also talks about how bullets from a 375 often will exit a broadside buffalo and potentially hit that other animal. So how do you square that circle? Well, long story short, this guy was using solids. And like I mentioned earlier, when you're talking about comparing the exact same bullet, a solid fired from a 375 H&H will penetrate deeper than a solid fired from a 9.3x62. Now, I mentioned earlier that I killed a buffalo with my 9.3x62 with 286 grain Swift A-frames. I was hunting in Zimbabwe in the Low-Veld very early in the year, February. It was very hot, thick, rainy while we were there. So this was challenging hunting. One morning, we got on the trail of what looked like about 4 bull buffalo together. We followed those buffalo, eventually caught up with them, but they had already bedded. We figured that these buffalo would leave that patch, head over to this field where they had been eating for the past couple of nights, and we found a good ambush spot where I could get on top of a big termite mound, see over this tall grass in that area, hopefully get a shot at one of these buffalo when they stood up in the evening and started heading towards that field. And that's exactly what ended up happening. These buffalo stood up, started walking in front of us a little over 100 yards away. We picked out a nice bull from this group. Turned out there was indeed 4 that we saw. I shot him broadside in the shoulder with that 286 grain A-frame. The other 3 buffalo immediately disappeared. He staggered, took a few steps with his rear end facing us, stopped. I reloaded, fired again, and I hit him right in the rear end where the spine meets the pelvis, and he instantly dropped. I topped off my magazine, we approached it, and while we were walking up to it, we heard the death bellow, which is always a good sign. I shot it twice more on the ground. Now, that first shot was with the A-frame. The next 3 shots were all with Woodley Full Metal Jacket bullets, all 286 grain projectiles. I recovered every single bullet from that buffalo, the A-frame and all 3 Woodleys. Now, I killed an American bison with my 375 H&H a couple of years ago. My first shot with the 375 onto this buffalo, it was about 100 yards away, also pretty close to broadside. I hit it a little bit far back. It was angling away from me a little bit. I hit it. It went through the paunch, hit the liver, and hit the back of the offside lung, stopped on the offside hide. I fired again, hit farther forward this time, hit both lungs, bullet lodged in the offside shoulder in this case. The buffalo took another few steps, laid down. I shot it again in the neck. That bullet exited, and that was the end of that with that buffalo. All 3 of those shots were taken with 300 grain Barnes TSX bullets from the 375. The shot through the neck exited, but neither of the shots to the body did. And those 300 grain Barnes bullets performed beautifully, expanded great, looked just like you would expect them to out of a Barnes advertisement. And they produced a wound almost as wide as the bottom of a Coke can through the lungs of that bison. And as you would expect, he didn't go very far at all after those shots. Now, Barnes bullets do penetrate really well, but they also do expand to a pretty large diameter, and it's not unusual to recover them from an animal that size. And I imagine if I would have had similar shot placement on a Cape buffalo, they also would have not exited. But if I were using 300 grain North Fork cut point solids or 300 grain Barnes banded solids on that bison with those shots, real good chance that they would have exited. So a soft point bullet from either cartridge is unlikely to exit a buffalo. Doesn't matter if it's a Barnes, an A-frame, a North Fork semi-Spitzer, anything like that. A high-quality solid like that North Fork cut point solid I keep talking about is much more likely to exit. especially from a close to broadside shot. And you will get substantially more penetration with a bullet like that than you will with a traditional soft point bullet. In gel, those cut point solids are going between 50 and 60 inches versus, say, 35 to 40 inches for the really good, high quality soft points for both cartridge. Now, I have a lot of experience using a 258 grain H-Mantle bullet out of my 9.3. That is a German bullet manufactured by RWS. It's pretty old. I think they released it in the 1930s. But long story short, this bullet has a dual core construction with a crimp in the jacket that makes the rear core hold together. So the idea with this bullet is that front core is made of a soft lead, has a thinned jacket, and when it hits an animal, that portion of the bullet will go to pieces, cause a massive wound cavity, fragments going everywhere, but that rear core is much harder and will often exit the opposite side of the animal. I've used that bullet on deer, feral hogs, a black bear, impala, and zebra. I shot a zebra with it in Zimbabwe. Once again, straight through the shoulder. That zebra dropped like it had been struck by lightning. Nice caliber-sized entrance wound. Massive internal damage. It looked like a hand grenade went off inside the chest cavity of that zebra, and then a nice caliber-sized exit wound out the offside shoulder. Plenty of penetration for medium game. I would not hunt buffalo with it. So I say all of these stories to tell you that, yes, the 9.3 will penetrate really well, but it all depends on the bullet that you are using. It needs to be a bullet of sufficient weight and appropriate construction. Now, one of the reasons the 9.3x62 penetrates so well is that it tends to use bullets with a relatively high sectional density, and it fires those bullets at a moderate velocity. So here's how the 9.3 and the 375 stack up next to each other in terms of sectional density. 250 grain bullets for both. 0.254 sectional density for the 375, 0.267 for the 9.3. 300 grain bullet for the 375 has a 0.305 sectional density. That is the same as a 286 grain bullet for the 9.3. A 350 grain bullet for the 375 has a sectional density of 0.356. The heaviest bullet I have ever seen offered in a factory load for the 9.3x62 is a 325 grain Norma Oryx. That bullet has a sectional density of 0.347. So the 375 has a higher upper end threshold for this stuff than the 9.3, but there's a lot of overlap in the middle with a lot of the most common bullet weights these cartridges are offered in. And depending on the details, they either have the same or very similar sectional densities at the lower end, or the 9.3 will have a small advantage. And when you are calculating sectional density for bullets of the same weight for these two different cartridges, since the 9.3 uses a smaller diameter bullet, those bullets will have a slightly higher sectional density. And you have to have a heavier bullet for the 375 to have the same sectional density, like with the 286 versus 300 grain bullets for each one. This leads me to my next point. Recoil. This is another area where the 9.3 has an edge. I calculated the free recoil energy generated by both of these cartridges, typical factory loads for each one, out of 8-pound rifles, respectively. And also, just for comparison's sake, I calculated recoil for a typical load for a 30-06 as well. 286 grain bullet at 2,300 feet per second generates 36 foot-pounds of recoil energy. So that's about 45% more than the 30-06. 375, 300 grain bullet at 2,500 feet per second generates about 51 foot-pounds of free recoil energy. That's about 41% more than the 9.3 and over twice as much as the 30-06. Now, that's all out of 8-pound rifles. My Ruger Hawkeye in 9.3x62 weighs 8.6 pounds as I hunt with it. That's with a scope, sling, full magazine. My Ruger M77 Mark II and 375 H&H weighs 11.4 pounds set up identically. So I calculated the free recoil energy for those exact loads I just described, but out of those exact rifles. The 375 has 35.8 foot-pounds of free recoil energy. The 9.3x62 has 33.5. So even in a situation where I'm firing the 375 H&H from a rifle nearly 3 pounds heavier, that is a gigantic difference. The 375 still has about 7% more free recoil energy than the 9.3. And that rifle for the 9.3 is on the light side as well. If you increase the rifle weight for the 9.3 to 10 pounds, free recoil energy drops down to about 29 foot-pounds of free recoil energy. That's only a little bit more than the 30-06. Do not discount how much of an advantage this is. The 375 H&H is certainly more powerful. But is it better? Well, if your initial shot placement is a little off, then no. And it is easier to shoot better with less recoil, and the 9.3 has an undeniable edge here. Now, moving on, the 375 H&H is a much higher velocity cartridge than the 9.3x62. Traditional big bore rifles generally don't have very fast muzzle velocities, right? The 450-400 shoots a 400 grain bullet at about 2150 feet per second. 458 Win Mag shoots a 500 grain bullet at about that same velocity. Same with the 470 Nitro. 500 Nitro shoots a 570 grain bullet at about 2150. The 416 Rigby, 458 Lot, and 9.3 are all going a little faster, all around 2400 feet per second. The 375 H&H is doing 2500 to 2550 with a 300 grain bullet. That goes up to about 2700 feet per second with a 270 grain bullet. Now, that higher velocity is a double-edged sword. On the plus side, it does result in a flatter trajectory and better performance at extended range. But how often is that important, especially in Africa? 400 yards is a long shot over there. Maybe on something like Mountain in Yala, you'd be more likely to take a shot at a range like that. But almost everything you shoot over there is going to be within 200 yards for plains game and probably within 100 yards for buffalo. Now, the downside of that higher velocity is it comes with increased chances of bullet failure, especially with older bullet designs at close range. Here's another excerpt from the 375 section of Any Shot You Want, written by Finn Agard. I have experienced bullet failures, though. The old Winchester soft with that little flat nose would often rivet or break up. Thrice I have had 300 grain soft nose bullets shatter in buffalo shoulder joints and fail to penetrate further. End of quote. Now, he does go on to say that he has experienced much better results with modern controlled expansion bullets. That has been my experience with the cartridge too. So I'm not saying not to hunt with a 375 because it's going to blow up on the shoulder or any of that stuff. As long as you're using an appropriate bullet, you should be in good shape. Now, I'm also not saying that bullet failures never happen with the 9.3. They do seem to be more common with the 375. And like I mentioned earlier, I think the more sedate velocity of the 9.3 also enhances penetration. Similar deal with, say, the 7x57 Mauser. Now, I often hear people say in critiques about both the 9.3 and the 375 that they're not, quote-unquote, stopping cartridges. That is true for both of them. But let's also get real here. You need to hit an animal in the right spot to stop a charge, regardless of what you are using. Bigger calibers do provide some leeway here, and they do deliver more effect on game. But it's also not like you can just shoot a charging buffalo anywhere with a 5.77 Nitro and be guaranteed to instantly stop that charge either. In a situation like that, between the 9.3 and the 375, the 9.3x62 might have a small edge here with the fact that it just facilitates better shot placement. And possibly you might be able to get back on target faster for a second shot, depending on how good you are with your rifle and what the exact circumstances of the charge are. I'm not sure how much of a difference that makes in the real world when the chips are down. I'd maybe give the 375 a small edge over the 9.3 here, but really there's probably not much practical difference between the two for stopping something like a charging buffalo. You really need to be using the right bullet in that situation, and it needs to be used in the hands of someone with a cool head that knows what they're doing and can place those shots exactly where they need to go. Now, there were some people named Osa and Martin Johnson. They were American explorers and filmmakers that did a lot of work in Africa in the 1920s and 1930s. Martin did a lot of the filming. Osa did a lot of the support work, and to include protecting him from wild animals. And there is a video you can find on YouTube of Osa Johnson killing a charging rhino with a 9.3x62. And by the way, that story I told you at the beginning of this episode with Don Heath killing the charging elephant that fell down and broke his arm, well, he was using a 9.3x62, firing a 275 grain Norma solid. And lest you think I am giving too much attention to the 9.3 at the expense of the 375 here, John Taylor relates a story about killing a charging buffalo with a 375 H&H in his famous book, African Rifles and Cartridges. To set the scene, he was following a wounded buffalo somebody else had shot. As they often do, this buffalo went into a nasty thicket. John followed it up with his 375. He eventually caught up to the buffalo, and I quote, "He was standing behind a dense clump of undergrowth with a little clear patch in the center of it, and there was a clear space about 11 paces wide between me and the clump. He must have seen some movement, for he was looking straight at me. I let drive immediately, but my bullet had to find its way through a tangle of twigs and must have been deflected slightly. These 300 grain bullets are excellent for this sort of thing, but there are limits to what you can reasonably expect. The bull dropped to the shot, but in an instant was up again and coming. I sank to one knee and waited for him to break through the bush. When he did, I gave him the left barrel fairly in the center of his great chest. Well, the effect of that shot was exactly as though there had been a steel hawser stretched across his path, just at the right height above the ground to whip the two forelegs from under him. He crashed on his nose and his knees and remained like that with his hindquarters in the air whilst I reloaded. I was about to give him a bullet in the spine when he keeled over, stone dead." End of quote. Now, that is an unusual story, and you don't often hear stories about people stopping charging buffalo with a shot from the 375 to the chest like that. Assuming he was telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, this shows that that can happen sometimes. Perhaps it's less common with a 375 than with a 458 or a 500, but it can happen. I just share all of these stories to say that if you place your shot well, they both work great, even on charging animals. Both cartridges also fit the bill well for all-around use. I took a trip to South Africa in 2014 and did not bring one of my own rifles. And so I just used several different camp rifles on that hunt. And among other rifles I used on that safari, I used a CZ550 in 375 H&H. The first animal I ever took with that cartridge was an impala at about 200 yards. I hit it just a little bit far back, and I clipped the back of both lungs, hit the liver. But that bullet made a massive wound in the animal, and the impala went less than 50 yards after the shot. And if you have ever watched any of my videos on YouTube, that's the impala you can see on the wall behind me. It's a European mount. Now, a shot on that exact same impala at that angle with that exact same shot placement with something like a 30-06 also still would have killed it, but it wouldn't have made quite as big of a wound. I'm sure we still would have found that impala, but it probably would have gone a little bit farther. So that is one of the benefits of a cartridge like the 9.3 or the 375 H&H on medium game like that. And while I think the 9.3x62 is wonderful for medium game, and it also works just fine on bigger game like buffalo, I think the 375 H&H is a little bit better choice for use on bigger stuff like that, provided the hunter can shoot it as accurately as they can in 9.3x62. You place your shots where they need to go with a 375 with a great bullet on a buffalo. It is deadly, deadly, deadly. That 375 CZ550 I just told you about, we still use as a camp rifle in Africa. And if a guy ever comes over, wants to hunt Cape buffalo and doesn't bring his own rifle, that's what he used. And there is no telling how many buffalo have been killed with that rifle. It is dozens, possibly upwards of 100. Now, at least with the typical hunter these days, it seems like the 375 H&H is primarily used for dangerous game today, and also on a mixed bag safari. Every now and then we have a guy comes over just for antelope and will bring a 375 to hunt everything with. But it's more common in a situation like that for someone to use a 7mm or a 30 caliber if they are only hunting plains game. Even if a guy is hunting buffalo and plains game, it seems like it's most common for that hunter to bring a 375 for the buffalo and then bring a smaller cartridge for the rest. It does happen, though. I've often found that when people want to go to Africa, specifically for buffalo, and they want to use their own rifle, they'll buy a 375 H&H or a 375 Ruger, specifically for that task because it is enough for the job. Recoil is manageable. Rifles and ammo for 375 are easier to find and less expensive than all of the other bigger stuff, 416, 458, 470, etc. Now, you can use the 375 on elephant, and people do, but it seems like elephant hunters will usually get something bigger for a hunt like that. The same is also true if they do a lot of buffalo hunting. So it seems like the 375 is primarily used on buffalo and hippo, etc., with a little bit of extension up to use on elephant and more extension down to use on antelope, deer, and the like. The 9.3 seems to be most popular among those who want a heavy-hitting, all-around rifle. Really popular in Europe where a person can hunt a wide spectrum of game. Roe deer, wild boar, red deer, maybe even bear, etc. Same thing in Australia where I've heard they're very popular for stuff like sambar deer. Same with stuff up in northern Australia. Boar, water buffalo, feral cattle, feral horses, all that stuff. But I don't often see people buying a 9.3 by 62 specifically to hunt buffalo with. Yes, it happens, right? I'm one of those people, so is my dad. But it seems like the people who use it on Cape Buffalo, and there aren't nearly as many of those people as there are people who use a 375 on buffalo, will use the 9.3 on that hunt specifically because they already own one and they like it, instead of going out to buy a 9.3 specifically to hunt buffalo with. I could be wrong about that. That's just the impression I get. Now let's talk about rifle and ammo availability for both. We'll start with rifles. At this instant, Ruger currently offers their #1 single shot in 9.3 by 62 as a 20-inch long barrel, full-length Mannlicher style stock. Looks like a beautiful rifle. Sauer makes rifles in 9.3. Same thing with Tikka. You can also get more expensive rifles from Rigby and Mauser with their Model 98 and Model 12. I think Blaser makes rifles in 9.3 by 62 as well. And if they don't right now, they certainly have in the past. As far as older rifles that were chambered in 9.3, you got the CZ550. There were some Ruger Hawkeyes made in 9.3 by 62. I don't think any were made in left hand like mine, but I know they made it for at least 1 year in their standard Ruger Hawkeye rifle. Companies like Husqvarna made them as well, and you can find older Mausers out there too. It's really too bad that CZ discontinued the 550. That was available in 9.3 and in 375 and in 458 and 416 and all sorts of great safari cartridges. I really like the 550 American I had previously, and I would have held on to it if I were right-handed or if I could have gotten that rifle in a left-handed version. As far as the 375 H&H goes, Winchester makes the Model 70 in 375 H&H. That's actually probably my #1 recommendation for someone that wants to go buffalo hunting with a 375 H&H with a new production rifle. The Model 70 Safari Express and Alaskan variants of the rifle are both chambered in 375 H&H. Both are great rifles, very similar overall. The Safari Express version has a 24-inch long barrel. The Alaskan has a 25-inch barrel. Two rifles also have a little bit different finish on them, but they are very, very similar. Both are excellent rifles. Formerly Dakota, now Park West Arms, also makes excellent 375 H&H rifles. They are pricey, but you get what you pay for with them, though. Bergara makes their Premier Canyon in it. Christensen Arms makes a Ridgeline in 375. You can get the Rigby big game rifle in it as well. Same thing with The Mauser 98, Blosser also makes their R8 in 375 too. As far as older rifles go, like I mentioned, the CZ550 was available in it, but it's been discontinued. Ruger made their number one in 375 H&H for a while. They also made their Safari Magnum in the cartridge. Remington made their 700 rifle in it. You can also find some old Browning rifles in 375. Same thing with old Kimbers. Specifically, they made the Caprivi and Talcatina rifles in 375. And while Kimber still lists them on their website, I think those rifles have been discontinued. But someone feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, though. The now discontinued Blosser R93 was available in it, and also a similar deal with the Husqvarna rifles I just mentioned. In this same vein, there are some magazine size differences between these two cartridges, but it varies depending on the rifle. For instance, the Model 70 in 375 has a 3-round capacity. You get a 4-round capacity in 375 for the Ruger M77 Mark II, 5-round capacity for the CZ550, 5 for the Mauser 98. For the 9.3, the Tikka holds 3 rounds. The Ruger M77 Hawkeye I have holds 4. Same thing with the Rigby Highland Stalker. Mauser rifles have 5 down. Same thing with the 550. Now I can hear somebody saying right now, John, if you can't get it done with 4 shots, then you have no business hunting. You should take up another hobby. To a certain extent, that is true. But there are times when those extra rounds can come in handy, even for a person that shoots well, especially on a dangerous game hunt. I will share a story with you that illustrates this. We had a guy that was hunting Cape buffalo in Africa with us several years ago with that Ruger guide gun in 375 Ruger. He was hunting very late in the day, right before dark, got a shot on a nice buffalo that was in an open patch, but standing literally right next to some thick brush. So we were running out of light, and there was a concern that this buffalo would get into the brush where things could get western, so to speak. Our hunter made a great initial shot on this buffalo. He was close to broadside, went straight through the shoulder. The buffalo swapped ends. He shot him again in the other shoulder. Johan, the PH, was with him. He fired with his .416 Rigby, hit the buffalo in the hips specifically to break him down. Because like I said, they did not want him to get into that thick cover as it was getting dark. The hunter fired again, also hit the buffalo in the chest. The buffalo went down. They thought it was over, but he started trying to get back up. The hunter reloaded, fired again. The buffalo went down. He continued trying to get back up, almost regained his feet. The hunter fired again, hit him in the chest. He went down again, shot him in the neck, and he still kept struggling and trying to get up. Between Johan and the hunter, they ended up shooting that buffalo 13 times. He was using a .375 Ruger, 300-grain Barnes bullets. Every shot was straight through the vitals, except that one shot where Johan hit him in the hips with his .416 Rigby to break him down. So yes, it is easy for people to dismiss concerns about magazine size because, after all, they shoot well, and they always have things go perfectly according to plan on all of their hunts. But in the real world, there is a very real benefit to having a couple of other rounds on tap just in case. You probably won't need them, but if you do, then you really will need them. Now, with regards to magazine size, the details depend on the exact rifle, of course, right? The single-shot Ruger number 1 just holds 1 cartridge regardless of the chambering. And a CZ in 375 will have a larger capacity than a standard Ruger Hawkeye or a Tikka in 9.3, for instance. So really, that Model 70 is the number 1 rifle in current production I would recommend that you hunt buffalo with. I'm not trying to pick on the Model 70 with its magazine capacity here, right? That's an excellent rifle overall. But that's also the only 375 H&H control feed rifle in current production, and the magazine capacity is a shortcoming with it. Now let's talk about ammo selection. You do have more choices for the 375. For instance, Midway has 34 ammo options listed on their website for 375 H&H, just 13 for 9.3x62. Just to rattle off a few here, you can get loads from Barnes with the TSX and Bandit Solid. You can get a Federal Power Shock loading. Get a couple loadings from Hornady. You got that interlock load I talked about earlier. They have loads with the DGX Bonded and DGS. You get the Hornady Outfitter load with a 250 grain CX. Federal offers loads with a 300 grain trophy bonded bear claw and sledgehammer solid and a 300 grain A-frame. They used to offer a load with the 300 grain Woodley Hydro solid, but they have it listed as discontinued right now. Nosler makes factory loads with 260 grain and 300 grain AccuBond bullets. They also make loads with 300 grain partition bullets and Nosler Safari solids. PPU makes a loading with a soft point. Remington makes a 270 grain soft point load. You can also get one of a couple different loads from Buffalo Bore. Now for the 9.3x62, Hornady makes that load with a 286 grain interlock. Swift offers factory loads for it with their Swift solid and the Swift A-frame. You can get that load from Federal, I mentioned earlier, with the A-frame and the Woodley Hydro solid. Nosler makes ammo for the 9.3x62 with their E-tip and AccuBond bullet. Norma makes several different factory loads with different bullets as well. There's that PPU soft point load. S&B makes ammo. So does Buffalo Bore. Now, that PPU load I keep talking about is the quote-unquote cheap ammo for both cartridges. Significantly less expensive than everything else for either one. Talking $30, $35 a box. Other 9.3 ammo is considerably more expensive than that. Other 375 ammo is quite a bit more expensive than even 9.3 ammo.
Okay, so there you have it, folks. There is a tremendous amount of overlap in the best use cases for each cartridge. They are both wonderful, all-around big game hunting cartridges. They're excellent for use on medium game. They will even work on thick-skinned, dangerous game like Cape Buffalo. Now, the 375 H&H is indeed more powerful. It is also on the correct side of the 375 caliber minimum some countries have. There are also more rifle and factory ammunition choices available for it. But on the other hand, the 9.3x62 really punches above its weight. It also has less recoil. Sometimes it also has an advantage in terms of rifle magazine capacity. I prefer the 9.3x62, like I said earlier, but the 375 H&H is also an awesome cartridge. I'm not going to tell anybody they are wrong for selecting this one. So what do you think? Let me know your thoughts on this subject. Leave a comment on this video. Tell me which cartridge you prefer. At the same time, feel free to share your experiences hunting with either one. Tell me about the game you took, the rifle you used, and the ammunition you used. Now, if you like this video and you want more stuff along these lines, make sure you hit that thumbs up button below the video. Make sure you subscribe to my channel so you get more of my future content. Also, click on the link in the episode description or in the pinned comment, or go to thebiggamehuntingblog.com/ebook. Sign up there. You will get my free ebook on the best hunting cartridges. Plus, you'll also start to receive the emails I send out every weekday about hunting, shooting, ballistics, things like that. If you like this video, you will love those emails. So thanks a lot for watching. Have a great day and good hunting.